This short video will provide an introduction to the film that we'll watch, Within Our Gates, by Oscar Micheaux, produced, directed, and written by Oscar Micheaux, which was released in January 1920, so just over 100 years ago. What we'll talk about is some of the historical context around the film, why it's significant, and we'll end with some things viewers should look for as they're watching the film. So we'll start with a short biography of Oscar Micheaux. He's one of the most important black filmmakers, early black filmmakers, whose work we still have. He was not the first black person to uh, record a motion picture, but his full-length film, Within Our Gates, his second film, is the uh, only remaining full-length feature film that we have from 1920. It's the earliest full-length feature film produced, directed by a black person that we have. Micheaux was born in 1884. He's, a generation removed from enslavement. His family and his life individually represents the phenomena that was occurring at the time called the Great Migration, where Africans born in the America that lived in the South were migrating to work in northern cities, also in the Midwest, and also to the West Coast. These Africans were escaping the terror of Jim Crow racism in the South, economic problems in the South, and were moving to better the lives of their families. And Oscar Micheaux's family was no different. His family originally migrated from Kentucky to Illinois, where he grew up and was raised, right near Chicago. It was there that he would develop a lot of traits that would show up in his films and novels later on. He writes about his voracious curiosity and how he uh, would often challenge people in authority, particularly the black preachers. He had a disdain from them from an early age because he saw his mother being taken advantage of by a preacher uh, when he was around 16. So he always has this kind of ambivalent relationship with the black church that shows up in his films. And there's another instance that we'll talk about soon. But he grows up in Illinois. He takes a number of odd jobs, and then he gets the job as a young adult as a Pullman porter, which was one of the most prestigious jobs a black man could get during this time period. We're talking about the turn of the 20th century. This job allowed him to travel all over the country. He made pretty good pay, and it was very prestigious. We get people with college degrees that were Pullman porters because it paid well, and it was a job of high esteem in the community. So he takes his money from being a Pullman porter, and he actually becomes what's called a homesteader. He purchases a property in South Dakota um, to begin farming. This was the dream of many of the Africans who had migrated from the South to own land, whether it be in the West or the Midwest, because it was hard to do so in the South with the racial violence and things that were occurring. So he actually becomes a homesteader in South Dakota, which was a program set up by the United States government after they had dispossessed the indigenous populations of the Midwest and West of their land. They were first offering it to European immigrants to settle there, and if they still had land left over, or if, in the case of Oscar Micheaux, those immigrants had defaulted uh, on their land claim, they would open it up to African Americans. So there were a lot of African Americans who got land this way as homesteaders on the prairies, and some of them migrated to Canada. There's in Alberta and places like that where they again faced discrimination. But Micheaux was one of these people. He was the only black person in this town. He had a successful farm at the beginning that he was cultivating, and he was well known throughout his town. He actually falls in love with the daughter of a white Scottish immigrant, but it's a star-crossed love, meaning that it can't go anywhere because of the time, the interracial relationships in the early 1900s, it's not possible to happen. Uh, so he gives up that relationship, and he actually gets married to a black woman from Chicago, and the marriage is going well at first, but he doesn't get along with his father-in-law, who is a black pastor, a well-known preacher in Chicago, and the friction between Micheaux and his father-in-law leads to the father-in-law actually coming to South Dakota and taking his daughter back to Chicago. And there's a lot of failed attempts for Micheaux to get her back, and this further sours his view on the black preacher class, this who he considers that are misleaders in the community, based off his experience with his mother years ago being swindled by a black preacher, and now his experience with his father-in-law. So we'll see how that comes into play. But not long after this marriage, his farm starts to take a downturn, and his business starts to go down. So he moves to become an author. His neighbors and other folks around him say, well, you have a very unique experience as being a black man from Illinois who's come and set up this farm, and you were successful for a while. You should write about that. You should write about being a black man who's become a homesteader, who's taken up the challenge of starting a business on the prairie. So he does. He writes the book, The Conquest, in 1913 about it's a semi-autobiography. It's fictional, but there's so much in it that is so close to his life that a lot of scholars consider it semi-autobiographical, because it talks about his experiences as being a black man in South Dakota. He actually talks about the interracial failed relationship that he was in with the daughter of the Scottish immigrant, and he also talks about his failed marriage and the role that his father-in-law played in that. In this book, it becomes a bestseller. He not only writes the book, but he promotes the book himself. He uses his connection as a Pullman porter to go all around the country promoting this book and selling it to not only blacks but even whites that lived around him on the prairie, his neighbors who starved for entertainment, will read anything, so they'll read his book. And he was able to make a living as an author selling his book. And then in 1917, he produced The Homesteader, which was kind of a rehash of the original story in The Conquest with some other things added. But just again, telling the story of a black man setting out, doing it for himself um, in this time of exploration in America, where people were really going into the West and the Midwest and trying their luck. So he does this, but the interesting thing that happens is actually right in between the publication of these two books, which is what we'll get into now, which is the emergence of the black film industry. And it's emerging in a very interesting time in the African world. So if we zoom out a little bit, um, around this time, Africa itself is in the grips of colonialism. The only place that's free is the Empire of Ethiopia. Everything else is colonized. So we're seeing that. We are seeing the brutality that's being exhibited upon African bodies all over the world. On the continent, you'll see on the left, image on the left is actually from the Congo. The image on the right is from, I think, Indiana in the States, where lynchings were common of black people, where they were public displays of terrorism, where white communities would brutalize usually black men, but there were black women that were lynched as well. And they were community events. And even afterwards, the photographs of the lynchings would be sold as postcards. So these are the things that are going on. And one of the driving forces of this dehumanization of black people is actually popular culture. So at the time, we're talking about what most people do for entertainment is seeing these vaudeville shows. There's no TV. Some people have radios, but these traveling acts usually always included a minstrel show. White folks in blackface promoting this vision of black culture that's buffoonish, that's childlike, and sometimes they even go as far as making black people out to be animalistic. They are extremely popular all over the country and even in Canada. The whole Justin Trudeau blackface thing exposed a lot of people to the fact that the man that wrote "Oh Canada" the national anthem was a performer of blackface minstrelsy. So this is the popular culture of the time. This is what people are going to see. This is what is educating new immigrants on what white America, how white America views black people. Uh, Not just black adults, but black children. We see things like the 10 Little Niggas and that old thing that many of us did as children. We used to say, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a tiger by the toe. But the original thing was eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a nigger by the toe. So this was contributing to the dehumanization of black folks throughout the United States and even throughout in Canada. And this would transition from the stage to the film because at the same time we're seeing the rise of motion pictures, the early rise of motion pictures. In fact, the first black character to appear in motion pictures was a white man in blackface playing the character of Uncle Tom in a production of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1903. So the first black character on film is a white man in blackface playing Uncle Tom in a feature film.